program which we've constructed has really been leading up to tonight's keynote. A lot of what we've put into our program has been influenced by Astrida's work. We've had an incredible workbook produced by Heather Contant with many strategies suggested by Astrida and her colleagues and other collaborators. And and I'll just describe some of, and we're just bowled over as well by the contributions of our participants who have been really fantastic and rich and have in many ways in the last day or two taken the seminar and the program on themselves, which is really incredible. So on Tuesday, we were able to have a row shop where we had a dragon boat excursion into the lagoon by Giudecca, all 20 of us, which was just a great way to kind of adapt a methodology to the specificities of Venice and the lagoon city as we conceive of it. Then on Wednesday, we had a day on an island in the lagoon called Sant'Erasmo, which is one of the major agricultural islands of the lagoon, where we had a collaboration between myself and Lodovico Guarnieri, and we did a Verena excursion, an intervention, where we submerged ourselves and invited our participants to also submerge themselves. There was wading going on, there was some swimming going on, and then that was followed by a discursive picnic led by Sasha Gora and the chef Marco Brevetti, where we were able to then engage our mouths and our taste buds to consider the politics of the lagoon and the water city. Then yesterday, God, it's been so busy. Yesterday, what did we do yesterday? We had an incredible meeting with Marcello Cerasuolo, who is a meteorologist here, and we went to an observatory in a school. I'll wrap this up quickly. That other than today, which we're still digesting, we had an incredible workshop led by our participants in small groups, going around Venice, engaging again with taste, engaging with bodies and sensing, hearing, and hydrophone recordings, carrying and caring for bodies of water. Some of us were carrying a bowl of water through Venice this afternoon. And I will stop now and introduce our speaker this evening, who I'm really thrilled to be able to invite, at least only online, into Venice, but hopefully again to Venice in the future, Astrida Neimanis, and her talk, How to Talk About Weather, Interventions and Social Infrastructure. Now I'll just read a brief bio before letting Astrida take over. Astrida Neimanis is Canada Research Chair in Feminist Environmental Humanities at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus on unceded Syilx Okanagan Nation territory. A cultural theorist working at the intersection of feminism and environmental change, her research focuses on bodies, water, and weather, and how they can help us reimagine justice, care, responsibility, and relations in the time of climate catastrophe. Her most recent book, Bodies of Water, Post-Human Feminist Phenomenology, which has been influential for many people thinking with water recently, is a call for humans to examine our relationships to oceans, watersheds, and other aquatic life forms from the perspective of our own primarily watery bodies and our ecological, poetic, and political connections to other bodies of water. Astrida's research practice includes collaborations with artists, writers, scientists, makers, education institutions, and communities, often in the form of experimental public pedagogy. Before joining UBCO, Astrida spent 6 years in the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies at the University of Sydney on Gadigal land in Sydney, Australia. And now I will stop talking, which I'm sure you'll be very happy about. Okay. Pass over to Astrida.
Oh, thank you so much. Just give me a shout if you can't hear me. Mic'd up here, I think. Okay, great. Thanks, and thanks also to Heather and Sasha. And it's so wonderful to be here. Wish I could be there in person, of course, but here I am instead, acknowledging that I am here on unceded silk territory. It's kind of rainy and wet today, perhaps appropriate for a talk in the context of leaky cities. So I am going to share my screen and give a talk. The slideshow that I'm going to show is really large, like the file is humongous, so it might glitch, which would be completely appropriate. But if it does, I'm just going to stop and read the talk, and that's fine. The talk is about 30 minutes long, and I want to begin. So actually, let me share my screen now. There we go. Right. So I want to begin by acknowledging that my talk today is derived primarily from an article that I just co-wrote with two fabulous colleagues, Jennifer May Hamilton and Tessa Zettel, both right now living in Australia. This is hot off the presses. It just went online a couple of days ago. So as I said, most of the talk is from this paper. So please check it out. If you want to read more thoroughly what I'm talking about and read more, I mean, I couldn't fit it all into the talk, it's all there. So please do. And so I also want to then acknowledge that this talk is part of a larger collaboration I have with Tessa Zettel, Jennifer Hamilton, and some others in the past. We call ourselves, let's see if I'm just gonna do this for the time being. We call ourselves the Weathering Collective. There are some URLs here up on the screen if you want to check us out. The Weathering Collective can store some of our work. It's been a little while, a year or two since we put anything new up, but at theweatheringstation.net. I'd also like to point out Tessa Zettel's Making Time project, which you can check out. That's mentioned partly in the article. And Jennifer's COWS project, a community weathering station in Armidale in northern New South Wales in Australia. And COWS' latest project called the Armidale Climate and Health Project. And there are some URLs if you want to check those out. This is the bigger context for everything I'm talking about. And I'm sort of keen to point this out because I want to say that the work I want to talk about today is really part of an ecology of thinking, making, doing together that comes together and then splinters off again in our own sort of individual projects and then comes together again. So it's really kind of this living, breathing, weathering collective assemblage that I'm going to be referring to today. Okay, so the talk, as I said, is about 30 minutes, and here we go. I thought about how to begin the talk, and while I often start with something like a little vignette, I decided I wanted to begin today with an epigraph that is taken from the first paragraph of an article that the late Lauren Berlant wrote in 2016. And rereading this article this week, I realized this is a really fitting epigraph for what we are trying to do. So let's begin with that. This is, as I said, from the first paragraph of this essay, The Commons, Infrastructures for Troubling Times, published in Environment and Planning D in 2016. Berlant writes, "This essay comes from my forthcoming book on the inconvenience of other people, which has three broad aims. The first is to provide a concept of structure for transitional times. All times are transitional, but at some crisis times like this one, politics is defined by a collectively held sense that a glitch has appeared in the reproduction of life. A glitch is an interruption within a transition, a troubled transmission. A glitch is also the revelation of an infrastructural failure. The repair or replacement of broken infrastructure is, in this forthcoming book's argument, necessary for any form of sociality to extend itself. But my interest is in how that extension can be non-reproductive, generating a form from within brokenness beyond the exigencies of the current crisis, and alternatively to it, too." Okay, As I let that sink in, I'm going to begin this slideshow, and it should just play on its own. The images that you're going to be seeing are taken from a variety of different social infrastructure projects that I've had the privilege of being part of over the last 5 years or so. And if there are any images, for example, the bright orange jelly baby that capture your attention, I'm happy to talk about those in the Q&A. Heads up that the jelly baby probably is quite akin to the bowl of water that you all carried with you on your walk yesterday, or today, I guess it was. So here we go. Okay. A glitch, you say. Berlant, prescient as always, wrote that article at least 5 years before the pandemic that would transform the reproduction of life worldwide. With the outbreak of COVID-19 in early 2020, social life changed fundamentally and overnight. In many places around the world, simple taken for granted gestures such as shaking a hand, sharing an elevator, or sitting beside a stranger on a bus became transgressive acts with myriad repercussions. Now, some 18 months later, even as restrictions lift, going back is a strange premise. It comes as no surprise to many of us that, quote, the infrastructure was broken even before the pandemic hit. The bigger revelation, perhaps, has been our coming to understand that sociality, or how we exist in common and with other people, as well as the systems, facilities, spaces, and architectures that facilitate collective existence, that this sociality is an infrastructure that needs our care and repair as well. As COVID-induced shifts in sanctioned proximity with strangers in quotidian and mundane situations have pushed many of us to re-examine these social infrastructures, we might also assess how these infrastructural breakdowns are relevant to the crises in which the crisis of COVID was nested. Might the particularly bright light that the pandemic has shone on these questions also provide an opportunity to resist the anxious logics of climate emergency and disaster capitalism, and instead re-examine the question of social infrastructures? Might thinking these questions in the context of climate catastrophe be an opening for theorizing and developing different kinds of infrastructures, perhaps non-reproductive ones, in Berlant's terms, that can, quote, generate a form from within brokenness beyond the exigencies of the current crisis and alternatively to it as well? Might we approach this as a method for building a feminist infrastructure where being together with others in low stakes, transitory ways can provide opportunities to form new relationships, to redistribute vulnerabilities, to rethink values and behaviors? Might these feminist infrastructures be capable of addressing environmental and social justice concerns together? We think yes. As a more specific response, we offer up a particular idea of feminist climate change infrastructure, one that expands Berlant's concept of common infrastructure into explicitly ecological realms. We argue that a feminist political project will always struggle against the material logics of infrastructure designed to privatize and individualize our struggle. Thus, in responding to climate change in feminist terms, we also need to support social infrastructures capable of sustaining a feminist response to ecological crisis. We introduced this argument first through a closer rehearsal of the concept weathering, a specifically feminist environmental concept that asks us to weather better. To clarify our use of this term, better weathering, we contrast infrastructural adaptation focused on weathering to adaptation aiming for climate resilience. And we argue that climate resilience is most often a rhetoric deployed to fortify ourselves against rather than grapple with our different vulnerabilities. Teasing out this proposal of feminist infrastructure, we draw on Berlant's notions of commons and stranger intimacy that she develops in the essay I already cited from. And we also draw on feminist eco-critic Sarah Ensor's notion of ecological cruising and queer fallout. We suggest that social infrastructures have everything to do with climate mitigation. I'm going to round out this talk by then, at the end, turning to a couple brief examples of how feminist environmental humanities, in my practice specifically, have sought to put these ideas into practice. Despite infrastructure's default associations with large-scale solutions, masculinist hierarchies, and the control of nature, these examples demonstrate possible and practical ways that queer and feminist thinking can also inform and experiment with responsive social, environmental, infrastructure development and design. Okay, weathering and weathering better. Weathering is a theoretical lens for understanding and responding to climate change in terms of the embodied and durational experience of the weather. As such, the concept is useful for an explicitly feminist response to climate change because it focuses attention on three feminist preoccupations: embodiment, everyday life, and difference. In return, weathering is politicized in specific ways by its entanglement with feminist thought, because embodiment, everyday life, and difference are politicized within the feminist critical tradition. The personal, i.e. my relationships, my job, my clothing, my sweat, the rain on my head, is political and different from yours in ways informed by structures of power. In previous work in collaboration with Rachel Walker and Jennifer May Hamilton, we've suggested the term weathering as a way to help us think about this. Weathering in this work is figured first as a bridge between climate and weather, as felt in the durational experience of embodiment. This was from the 2014 article by myself and Rachel Walker. And secondly, as a concept capable of materializing differently embodied experiences of social injustice and human cultural hierarchies in ecologically attentive terms. And that is from the short piece in Feminist Review that Jennifer and I wrote in 2018. Both of these, and thereafter, theorizations of weathering, insist that weathering is always more than meteorological and never separable from the total climate of social, political, and cultural existence of bodies. This draws explicitly on the anti-racist feminist work of Christina Sharp, who argues that the total climate is anti-Blackness. Sharp's work develops a crucial attention to weathering in Black feminism in ways that are different from but deeply instructive for our weathering projects. Extending these arguments about the imbrication of sociopolitical conditions with the weather, we suggest that weathering is also about the coloniality, misogyny, the resourcing and thingification of other bodies, poor, queer, non-human, disabled. Weathering as a concept thus makes three interventions into thinking about climate change. First, it opens up space to consider the relationship between the abstract concept of climate change and everyday embodied experiences and inheritances of bodies in the weather world. Second, it reinforces a feminist environmental humanities argument that insists that environmental justice, including climate justice, must incorporate a long history of intra-human social justice struggles: anti-colonial, anti-racist, feminist, crip, and queer. Finally, it reminds us that the weather itself is political, and any response to weather, however mundane, also expresses some kind of politics. As a guiding concept, then, weathering encourages an analysis of structural and systemic violence as essential to thinking through changing climates, and it gives us a lens to do this that resists the abstraction of climate change in order that we focus on specific bodies, bodily difference, in everyday life in the weather world. Informed by this definition of weathering, feminist environmental scholarship and praxis such as ours resists the simplistic claim that we are all in this together. And instead, we inquire into how we can weather together better, where such better weathering would entail both attention to and accountability for different bodies' weatherings. This advances the notion that both being in common and also different, i.e. we are all in this together, but we are not one and the same, is foundational to this thinking. Taking all of this into account, Better weathering thus demands two things. First, that we connect the banality of everyday embodied weathering to larger socio-political structures. And second, that we do the hard work of redistributing both vulnerability and shelter. Since 2015, I've been part of the loose collective of humans called the Weathering Collective, along with Jennifer and Tessa, the we, who are this paper's authorial voice. The Weathering Collective along the way has also included Rebecca Giggs, Kate Wright, and some others. From the beginning, our collective's ambit was to activate the theoretical concept of weathering via a shared bodily praxis or a sort of methods laboratory that borrows modes of doing and being from fields like socially engaged art, community organizing, ethnography, performance, body care, craft, and DIY publishing. Recognizing that there is no ideal form of weathering, we are always weathering and doing so differently, the Weathering Collective proposes diverse, concrete social experiments. Attuning ourselves to our own and to others' weather systems, we observe what socialities emerge when weather and climate are centered in relational practice. Lately, the collective's work has shifted from a focus on how climate change is felt and embodied to how it might be engaged collectively, socially, and politically. Put otherwise, while some of our earlier experiments were buoyed by the question, how is climate change me? The capacity for these investigations to move us from a propositional social ideation to a new collective material situation seemed foggy. So now we want to pay more attention to this fog, more explicitly probing the question, how is climate change we? The we invoke here is not a universal one on the same scale as climate, but rather kind of like Eve Sedgwick's queered we, what she calls a promiscuous we, that is, quote, me plus anybody else. This we wants to know, how is climate change with us in this particular place in our current configuration of the social? How could it be here with us and as us differently while supporting human differences? A response to these questions requires attention to the social world and the way that weather is currently rendered as part of the status quo and managed for us by infrastructure. Weather is predominantly governed through large-scale infrastructures, stormwater drains, salt sheds, seawalls, roads, dams, climate-controlled buildings, and transport vehicles, all of which seek to minimize weather's interruptions of daily life. In a time of climate change, a neoliberal logic of resilience informs the design and delivery of these infrastructure adaptation projects in order to manage the increasingly bad weather while also protecting structures of power and sometimes also exacerbating precarity. These massive infrastructural interventions, developed in the name of resilience, have long afterlives and lock in a particular future for us all. Infrastructure policy and design, driven by resilience, not only seeks to embed disaster capitalism within physical infrastructures, but also to maintain a neoliberal paradigm within our social infrastructures. In keeping the weather out, such large-scale infrastructure limits certain kinds of social interactions that arise from collective climate change response. For example, we recently read that New York City is planning to demolish the East River Park for a US $1.45 billion flood management project, which will shrink public space to protect private real estate development and commercial space. If public space is the first land sacrificed for flood mitigation, there will be even less room for relative strangers within or across communities to engage in casual experimentation in how to be social together differently. In the vein of the gentrification of Times Square documented by Berlant and Warner in Sex and Public from 1998, intimacy among strangers is either criminalized, commodified, feared, or imperiled in these kinds of responses to climate change. And perversely, despite the widely documented synergies between individualistic neoliberal ideology and resilience, individual differences are only socially permissible or even possible in expressions of independent strength or privately managed dependencies. What is not desirable or conceivable in a neoliberal resilience framework is the sharing of unprofitable, slow, and diverse vulnerabilities expressed between different strangers in a common space. Although we share a common world, there is in fact a dearth of opportunities in contemporary Western societies to explore what possibilities might emerge by being in common space with others in non-transactional relation. Moreover, various feminist critiques of resilience remind us that enduring climate change under a neoliberal resilience regime would necessitate a hardening of the self and society against vulnerability and exposure. For those who cannot afford adequate shelter or who are not protected by resilience infrastructure, a fortification of the self against the body in the weather world is required for bare survival. This move deeply entrenches unjust hierarchical structures and refuses to acknowledge the complex intersection of embodied difference and environmental variation that the concept of weathering emphasizes. This is also why weathering as a conceptual proposition is not quite enough. Weathering describes embodiment difference in weather as is, but the adverb better, as in weathering better, is an ethical stance and calls for attention to different experiences of vulnerability and action towards the improvement of certain human circumstances. Feminist and related critical approaches to environmental humanities insist that even as we bring the non-human into focus, we must not let go of the intrahuman hierarchies that reinforce uneven vulnerabilities. While environmental humanities literatures often focus on meaningful encounters with non-humans, a mushroom, a river, a storm, as important elements for forging different kinds of relations, we aver that it can be even more difficult to open up the riskiness of intrahuman encounters, particularly when we cannot rely on something like a progressive political identity to bind us a priori. Thus, countering a neoliberal model of resilience and in response to environmental humanities frameworks that sometimes prioritize more than human worlds over attending properly to human ones, we argue that weathering better requires different social infrastructures in order to build a feminist otherwise. Attuning to and accounting for bodies in a common weather world whose effects are weathered differently results in an explicitly feminist model of climate change adaptation. In other words, care and repair of social infrastructures from within the crisis, but in excess of it, comprises a radical feminist response to climate change. Lauren Berlant's notion of the commons theorizes an infrastructure that supports a critical understanding of what is common. But for Berlant, the commons is social, but not mutual. Enacting a form of sociality she refers to as stranger intimacy or non-sovereign relationality. Such stranger intimacy accurately acknowledges the ways in which our bodies affect one another due to our proximal relations, while admitting that, quote, just because we are in a room together does not mean that we belong to the room or to each other. For Berlant, such intimacy is predicated on being with rather than belonging, i.e., on a common situation rather than a common identity. In terms of climate change, this concept is useful because, as Rosie Braidotti insists, we are all in this together, but we are not one and the same. So what is shared in climate crisis is not necessarily belief, desire, or future hopes, but the fact that we are beings sharing infrastructures to manage a weather world that may or may not accommodate us equitably. You could say that in this way, quote, "Other people are inconvenient," as the title of Berlant's forthcoming and posthumous book reminds us. The commons as a big kumbaya of shared interests and desires is never going to happen. While big climate change infrastructures may purport to protect us from the inconvenience of the weather, as we see in the example of the New York floodplain proposal that will remove public park space, these moves can also remove the opportunity to deal with the inconvenience of other people. When we no longer have the occasion to confront other people's inconvenience, the possibility of a commons, fraught as it always will be, withers. This might also give us pause to wonder about the unquestionable benefit of protection from the weather. What happens when we, in big scare quotes, no longer have to deal with weather's inconvenience? What atrophies? What disappears from sight? This is why weathering as a feminist concept does not unilaterally endorse more shelter. In a more nuanced and far more complex vein, weathering insists on the redistribution of shelter and vulnerability according to the different weather patterns that we all differently endure. Activating opportunities for relative stranger intimacy in this context can also be scaffolded through queer feminist eco-critic Sarah Ensor's concept of queer fallout. In her environmentally attuned reading of Samuel Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, Ensor highlights social encounters that are brief, ephemeral, accidental, alongside more durational or intentional ones. Drawing on Delaney's descriptions of walking down a neighborhood street in New York, where people gather on stoops, exchanging mundane conversation, but in doing so, weaving a crucial kind of social fabric, Ensor develops the idea of ecological cruising. Despite not being predicated on a long-standing relationship or deep participation, these kind of non-committal relations can still comprise a social ecology infused with an ethos of care. The absence of close or sustained relations between individuals is therefore not a threat to community, but rather the necessary fabric that subtends it, what Delaney refers to as, quote, the lymphatic system of the democratic metropolis. Ensor's move here is to extend this idea of cruising to our relationships with the non-human world that we similarly cruise, forging ephemeral relations that for most of us will always be somewhat backgrounded and overshadowed by the more primary relationships in our life, but which can nonetheless form this critical lymphatic system of an ecological multiverse. Cruising between the social and the ecological, Ensor's work argues that responding to climate catastrophe demands forging relations, but ones that are not necessarily monumental, committed, long-term, or serious. The everyday ephemeral also has the potential to be politically transformative and infrastructurally reparative. So thinking alongside both Berlant and Ensor, we propose that these modest and non-committal stranger intimacies can be cultivated as part of new social infrastructures capable of interrupting large-scale infrastructures and neoliberal resilience logics. Just as our environmentalism will be made up of incomplete and metonymic gestures of relation to, quote, the planet, a feminist politics that subtends this will be similarly provisional, partial, and minor, yet citing Ensor, no less important for being a bit more diminutive. We contend that feminist infrastructures for better weathering can be built in these everyday spaces of a social but not mutual commons, where politics are likewise no less trivial for manifesting in mundane stranger intimacies. In fact, aligning with the feminist adage, the personal is political, imagining infrastructure for better weathering dials into the canonical feminist ambit of recuperating, revaluating, and remaking everyday life and practice. We argue that differently scaled infrastructure needs to be taken seriously if we are to offer an alternative to the neoliberal model of climate adaptation. So, as humanities scholars and practitioners interested in social art practice and community engagement, what does this look like concretely? How can we provide these sutures to this broken infrastructure? What might be seen as reprieves that can help us build the social muscles for being in common in our difference, these social infrastructures that we so desperately need. Of course, we are neither architects nor planners, so our response is to welcome the opportunity to manufacture opportunities, ephemeral, transitory, non-committal ones, for stranger intimacy and ecological cruising through what we might think of as training sessions, workshops, walkshops, gatherings, performances, and events that provide an opportunity to experiment with different modes of sociality in the context of low-stakes vulnerability. These are opportunities to think and talk across difference, pay attention to how we weather differently, and imagine ways in which both vulnerability and shelter could be more equitably distributed. Through the purposive fashioning of these infrastructures as places to train these social modulations, better weathering might take seed. I've written about some examples of these in other places. These include walkshops, as excellent training in being together in difference, held by a specific container of time and space, walking together with strangers, engaging in shared experiments from differently weathered perspectives, asks that we grapple with the political, ethical, and moral complexities of building publics or a commons in situations where any togetherness is always ambivalent. To borrow Berlant's terms, these ephemeral infrastructures are trainings in ambivalence. Some of the examples I've been involved with include organizing a train shop, walk shop, to a mining museum in Lithgow in New South Wales, which is actually part of the images you're seeing now, in order to think about the politics of extractivism in conversation with the place and the people who have lamented its end. These have also included a walk shop / ferry shop around Sydney Harbour to think about the militarized nature of that place, invisible to regular Sydney ferry cruisers, but also everywhere in plain sight. Militarism in which we are all always complicit. These have also included a meditative walk about endings that followed the Cooks River in the inner west of Sydney, from where it begins in a draining ditch in a golf course to where it ends as the magnificent Pacific Ocean. Guided by the welcome of Elder Auntie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor, that walk was also an offering to country, even as we walked, most of us, as settlers on stolen land. In other words, what all of these examples, these different walkshops have in common is their role as a social infrastructure that deliberately pauses around a certain kind of glitch, or what Berlant called that troubled transition, where the reproduction of a way of life stumbles, and new modes need to emerge, not from somewhere outside of or in opposition to what is broken or breaking down, but from within it. As Berlant says, generating a form from within brokenness, but hopefully beyond the exigencies of the current crisis as well. Not everything fits together always or well, but that does not mean that change will not emerge from the mess of things. As Berlant says, if scenes of collective being are, quote, graceless, absurd, or willful, the risk of not trying for the common of awkwardness, complicity, and intimacy would be even more ridiculous and deadly. Sometimes complicity just is, and that can still be a part of the transformations needed to weather better together. I'm just going to, in the last couple of minutes, I see we're running out of time. I'm just going to give you a little bit more about one of the examples you're also seeing here, which was the Community Weathering Station Symposium up in Armidale in 2019. One element of the symposium that was hosted by Tessa, Jennifer, and myself was a survival skills workshop. It included zine making, darning, mask sewing, and also a third optional activity located off to one side. A hand-drawn notice on the adjacent sandwich board read, "Do you need a trim, a quick underbuzz, something more daring? I will cut or style or braid or play with your hair, and I would love to talk to you about the weather while doing so. Maybe we can all be a bit brave and a bit vulnerable together. Hashtag haircuts for planetary survival." And next to the board, I'd set up a large mirror, a trolley, clippers, professional scissors, hair clips, a towel, a spray bottle of water, and those who attended the workshop were invited to come over and let me give them a haircut. Over the next hour, 2 different participants availed themselves of this opportunity. Our hypothesis, only loosely formulated before the workshop, was that the haircutter-client exchange is this kind of form of sociality that in some ways responds to NSOR's call for non-committed relationships. Intimacy is fleeting, but perhaps no less transformative for it. After all, casual conversation is often a cornerstone of the haircutting relationship. While referred to sometimes as non-task related service conversation, this chit-chat can nonetheless open to surprising levels of intimacy. Since talking about the weather is a euphemism for this kind of chit-chat that we often have in the hairdresser's chair, we wondered, could this particular type of stranger intimacy also open space for reimagining one's relationship to climate change? Noting that moving away from a resilience-based approach to climate change was part of what we were trying to do in this symposium, we hypothesized that hashtag haircuts could offer a germane opportunity for experimenting in social forms that explicitly invite conversations about risk and vulnerability, while also practicing that vulnerability together in that, there you see it, haircutter-haircuttee relationship. Of course, this was not a real haircutting situation. I'm not a professional hairdresser. I've been cutting my own hair and my family's hair and my friends' hair for many years, but I'm self-taught. I don't charge anything. I make my money otherwise. So in these ways, our experiment deliberately countered the neoliberal resilience logic of transaction or commodification. Moreover, even though our encounter was fleeting, oftentimes in real service encounters, you're actually developing a long-term relationship with a hairdresser, but that's not exactly what we were interested in here. We were more interested in this fleeting example that NSOR describes as cruising, right? Haircutting as a spatially intimate practice of being with that Berlant also theorizes as part of the social infrastructures of proxemics. So in line with some of these propositions, I'm just skipping a bit because I do want to get to questions. We thought that haircutting could rethink relations beyond the human as I invited my clients to chat about the weather. Yet, although I anticipated a brief but meaningful, non-committed yet personal conversation on climate change and vulnerability, I have to admit this didn't really come to pass. Even as I opened up possibilities for conversations on weathering, I asked, so how are you feeling about the weather? Does climate change worry you? Our exchanges were kind of awkward and stilted. This was less the case with the first participant, but I'd met them already the previous evening and they'd already told me that they didn't really care what their hair looked like. The second client, however, already had a pretty stylish haircut, and he had also confessed a little bit of reluctance to participate, noticing my own freshly shaven head and my admitted lack of proper credentials. So I was a bit nervous. I didn't want to mess up, and I didn't really fully sink into the conversation. I wasn't confident with the cutting or the conversation, and so I found the exchanges a little bit banal. The cut was pretty good in the end, but I'm not sure what kinds of social infrastructures were actually disturbed in any way. So, just in closing, right, is this a failed experiment? Thinking along with Berlant, I'm reminded of the fallacy of smooth or easily achievable relations of belonging. Although the first haircut was a bit more successful, I actually learned more from the second one. Here, trust was not prefigured and was additionally strained by the participants' reluctance. The heightened ambivalence of the situation, with neither an existing relationship nor a professional credential to bolster the encounter, made a redistribution of vulnerability seem a little bit more possible. Perhaps the brevity of these haircuts also prohibited deeper conversation. Each cut only lasted about 20 or 30 minutes. If future experiments took more time, extending the haircut maybe to the customary 55-minute appointment, maybe the conversation would deepen. And although time management is often framed as a neoliberal tactic for alienating us late capital subjects from meaningful relationships to our labor and to others, one key lesson I've learned from all of this is that the antidote to neoliberal time management is not the elimination of time or its organization, but rather the rehearsal of different kinds of structures of time. One scholar of hairdressing notes, for example, that hairdressers actively manipulate time to create this trust-based relationship with their client. It's a contract, you sit in the chair for 55 minutes, no more or no less. It makes perhaps ironic sense that this contractual commitment to clock time is actually what facilitates new, risky, and interruptive forms of sociality. So in future experiments with haircuts, but also in walk shopping and other composed situations, I'm interested in further experimenting with how alternative modes of time management can resist neoliberal commodified transactions. And this is where I'm going to leave you, on the rather practical and banal note about time management, but one that I think is probably quite fitting. Like infrastructure more generally, the boring things are what make it work. Time and space and having some sense of their parameters are things that hold us, such that we may be able to grapple with our own and each other's vulnerabilities a little more willingly, knowing that we are held, and knowing that we are held in this way, knowing that as we are held in this way, the inconvenience of other people, and maybe even the inconvenience of the weather, are things we can learn to bear more equitably. Quote, moving towards each other, in Berlant's words, to make new forms of approach from difference and distance. And that's the end.
Thank you, Astrida. That was incredible. And we just had a round of applause in the room. I'm not sure it came through, but I think maybe we'll start by offering already open, because we don't have so much time. And wonder if any of the participants from Seminar 4 have questions to pose.
Sorry, our camera is here on my right, but the screen is in front of me, so I don't even see you. You're very kind. Thanks a lot. It's very interesting. I talk from the perspective of critical geographers, so not from a different perspective. And I find striking that in critical urban geography, there is this notion of social infrastructure. And there's this notion of people as infrastructure brought up by anthropologists like Abdul Simon. And there, it comes from a critique towards what we think is an infrastructure, generally in cities, something material that doesn't move. And it's a call for a process of what they call unlearning. So it's not about creating something new. It's not about saying we need a certain kind of infrastructure, but we actually need to think again, what is an infrastructure that sustains life in the city? And starting from there to think about conditions of possibility for empowerment and radical change. And so I was curious, how does this relate to you and your practice? Because like, how do you, or if you do learn from what is already there? There are social infrastructures, collectives, communities that are already working. And so how do you position yourself and also on your collective, not yourself, just you, I mean, your kind of work, and you know, who do you engage? Who is your social infrastructure that you're trying to create? And how do you learn from what is already there or not? Maybe that's also another position I would be very interested. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a great question. Of course, there's so much amazing work happening across various fields, anthropology, geography, about, you know, critical infrastructures, certainly influenced also by the amazing work happening in fields like design justice and critical access studies. Like, there is so much great work about this out there. So, you know, you know, we are all, like, our collective is certainly influenced by all this work. I think what we are trying to do is use, like, the inspiration from some of this work to really think about what the theoretical proposition of weathering could look like in practice, right? So it is not in the sense of inventing new infrastructures, but it is social or otherwise, but about how can we use some of these forms, or often torque or tweak some of these forms, to be able to experiment with this weathering better. Like, how can we redistribute shelter and vulnerability through these acts of being together in difference? How can this open up to that possibility? We're quite interested as scholars that the theoretical, because we're you know, primarily humanities scholars, that the theoretical work we're doing is also being sort of tried out in practice. How well does this work? How well doesn't it? The other thing I would say in response to your question, though, is kind of the point I began on, right? Like, the pandemic and the way that it revealed the social and our social patterns of sociality as an infrastructure, right? That perhaps wasn't noticed until it was taken away. And I'm speaking here of like, in a general sense. Of course, there are plenty of people who were never able to be social, you know, easily in the ways that Western societies ask us to be, because of various access issues and things like that. So, you know, I'm using "we" very circumspect here, but you know, noticing that infrastructure is not just these built forms, but also these habits and patterns of sociality, was really brought home to us, right, in the last year and a half. So I don't want to get too far away from your question, but what we're trying to do then is not reinvent the wheel. We're drawing also on decades and decades of feminist scholarship about everyday life and, you know, everyday activisms happening through being in time and place together, right? Like, that's really our primary inspiration. We're thinking, like, some of these spaces are withering, they're being taken away. They're, you know, we're losing the opportunity to meet in public places with all sorts of different kinds of infrastructural changes, sometimes related to climate change mitigation. We're losing these public opportunities. So what would it look like if we, as activist scholars, like, rehearsed some of these spaces, right? Opened them up. They're opened up in every case to different kinds of publics. They're always open. Who shows up is always interesting. You can never know in advance what the composition of your, you know, little mini public is going to be. Of course, it's self-selecting to some extent, but through all of these experiments, we've also had really interesting and surprising, you know, coming together of really different perspectives and worldviews that held in this space-time in this way for the duration of the experiment really allows this kind of perforation of existing sort of social understandings of weather to, you know, occur. I'll leave it. That was a really long answer. I'm sorry. Let's take maybe some more if there are any more questions. And I'd also love to hear more about your own workshop today and how any of this resonates if there's time for it.
Hi. Sorry. Thank you so much for this. This was truly amazing, and I just wanted to express that your work has been formative for my thinking. So thank you so much for being here with us. And I would like to ask you about these different modes of involvement that you were addressing. Because recent research in like on the notion of care, it occurs to me that most of the time it's about these, like a commitment, a long-term involvement, some sort of devotion. And I thought it was really compelling that you were referring to practices of ecological cruising and all the randomness involved in that, and this, the non-committedness that I also perceive as a vigorous opposition to, I don't know, practices of geoengineering that are seeking for a technological fix in order to save the mess that we are in currently. And I think there's something to this transience and non-committedness. And I was just wondering, how do you take this to your writing, particularly when it comes to working collaboratively? Because you've done this. This is also something that grapples me, how to work collaboratively and with that methodological ideal in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. And I love it because it allows me, first of all, to give major props to Sarah Ensor for her work on ecological cruising. That's been really inspirational to me. There are a couple of papers she's written. One is called Touching Gleaning. I think it was in the ISLE journal some years back, and one in Environmental Humanities journal from around 2017, I think. So check out her work. It's so great. And I remember when I first read it, I was really like troubled by it, right? What? Like you're making this argument that we shouldn't have long-term, deep, committed relationships to the environment, you know? And I really struggled with it because coming from my own feminist sort of theoretical background, I just found this like difficult. And then the more I sort of understood and actually experimented with what she was saying, I really came to feel like in my bones the truth of it, right? Like she says, the earth will never be our primary relationship, right? Like as humans, it's always in the background, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a relationship of care and of concern for it in this kind of cruising manner. It doesn't mean that we can't still have that cruising relationship, as she writes, subtend the social fabric in which our more primary relationships are nested. Like you need that weave of cruising care for the other ones to work. And I just think that is just so true. Like if any of us tried to have a primary committed long-term deep relationship with everything we're supposed to care about, like it just wouldn't function. We just don't have the capacity for that. And you also bring up the literature on care. And for me, one of the most important aspects of some of the recent literature, and I'm thinking maybe here of Maria Puig de la Bellicasa's work particularly, is that care is also just about the mundane labor of it, right? Like just cleaning up the shit, right? It's about doing the work, showing up, and like doing what it needs to keep something going. And so in a cruising relationship, that can absolutely be the case, right? You can still attend in that space and time to just the work that needs to be done. And when I think then about my own collaborations, some of them are more long-term and committed, such as my research collaboration with Jennifer Hamilton that has been ongoing since 2015 and, you know, has moved through several projects, and we do have a deep and committed research relationship. But many of my, you know, relationships are more cruisy. And the workshops themselves, I think, like I love looking at that slideshow and remembering these people that I'd forgotten about, you know, people that are no longer part of my life, but came into it for that 1 or 2 or 5 hours. We had a really amazing conversation. We shared something meaningful. We probably, left something with each other in a meaningful way, but then we went off and did our own things and took those experiences elsewhere. So that's also super valuable that I love about these kinds of experiences is you don't need to stay in touch with everybody. You don't need to have this committed relationship. The container of time and space holds you for something to happen, for some sort of, perforation, to something to leak out of you and into each other. It's like a leaky infrastructure in the best way. And then you move on.
Thank you.
We have other questions in the room? Yeah, we have 2. Would you like to come up and then Jonathan? Yeah. Astrida, you're okay to take more? Yeah, okay.
Hi, I come from a background of photography, architecture, and also currently land use governance. And so I was drawn by how the way photographs are used to document and show this more ephemeral practices. And I wonder, it struck me that a lot of it felt like a kind of choreography. And so I'm curious about how you see the way that you practice this, but also maybe some of that sets a kind of score to be performed elsewhere. And how much of that is a part of the practice or could be. And then the other one is speaking on commons. I don't think, it wasn't brought up in your lecture, but Eleanor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons, and the more kind of legal codes, and maybe you would consider that a different kind of a structure, but I wonder how much of that kind of choreography code might be considered as a part of this kind of social infrastructure that you described, that maybe could be instantiated in more places beyond the examples you gave in the document. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great question. And thanks for it. Yes, these experiments are in a way highly choreographed, right? And explicitly so. I've been doing them for about 6 years or something like that. And I was going to end my talk with this, and I didn't have really time to fit it in. But really, and it's kind of why I ended on that note of time management and just kind of the banality and practicality of things. Because if anything that I've learned, and anyone who's an artist or has a practice-based sort of research methodology will know this, it's the structure that allows the experimentation to happen, right? So every time I host an event like this, we're really careful about certain care things, giving really explicit details about where to meet, how to get there, how long it will take you to get there by public transport, by walking, by car. If you use mobility aids, how you can, find us, how, what the terrain is like, if you have to bring kids, or if you want to bring kids or dogs or pets. We're really careful to create a highly choreographed set of instructions and sort of expectations management for the event. We're really careful to plan a starting point, often a middle and an end, so that this structure, this really choreographed thing, can hold all of the things that will happen inside of it that we have no idea what they will be. So for example, with the last set of images, that was us walking along the river with Annie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor out to the ocean, and we ended up on the beach. That was a performance walk that, at the end, after talking and talking and talking about it, came down to a very simple but specific choreography, follow the river to the ocean. That was the instruction, right? And slow your body down to match the tide so that it would take 8 hours following walk the tide out. Actually, that was the instruction, walk the tide out. And so simple, but a very particular choreography. Match your body to the tide, walk it out. And then anything that happens in there is where the real good stuff happens. But you need the structure to allow that to happen. So I'm really super like finicky when I collaborate on these things, like to have certain details absolutely, trialed, nailed down, figured out, so we can give people that freedom not to be like concerned about those things, and they can just allow the social to happen in the spaces. And I mean, I have to admit, I haven't read Ostrom's work in a long time, like probably 10 years. But I think like recalling what I do of it, I also see things like policy, like law, like these are also structures in a way that can allow things to happen within them. They sometimes those structures need tweaking and need repair themselves, but like they're the structures that make up, I think, like the infrastructure. Maybe I didn't put that quite right, but hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're like Yoko Ono's text-based scores, but performed collectively. So it's beautiful to see the documentation.
Yeah.
Astrida, I'm afraid we're being kicked out of the building. So I liked that. I think one of the final lines was walking the tide out. I think that was perfect, and actually reflected a lot of some of our activities this week and a lot of the other conversations around and the other seminars around Venice, tides, physical infrastructures, and maybe some social infrastructures to be developed in response to them. But thank you so much again, Astrida, and I'm sure, yeah, we'll see you again soon.
Yeah, I wish I could be there and continue the conversation over a glass of wine, but we'll save that for another time. Thanks so much, everyone, and please feel free to contact me if you want to follow up on anything.